Okay, well, thank you all. It's great to see you all back. I hope you had a good night and appreciate all your inputs and time yesterday. I thought maybe I'll just quickly recap. I mentioned this at the end yesterday, but recap what we're going to cover today, and then we'll dive into it. So today we'll kick off. Actually, we're going to kick off with Hallie just taking 5 or 10 minutes to go over what we did on the wall. As you see, we've kind of reorganized what we had. We've put it into kind of very broad categories. So we'll spend 10 minutes just kind of looking at that and reviewing that quickly. But then we'll get into essentially an introduction to storytelling. It'll be fairly brief, but just how storytelling is a critical part of your overall tourism experience and what you'll offer. We'll come back to the concepts that you started yesterday. I see some of you have been kind of refining and working on those. So we'll come back to those if you have questions and want to dive deeper into those, and then we'll kind of wrap them out in terms of that last page that we didn't cover yesterday. We'll look at pitching and describing your experience. So we'll look at that, as Hallie mentioned yesterday, that 60-second, or no, she only gave you 30 seconds. I'll give you 60 seconds. We can debate which one is, which you want to go for. You can choose. But either 30 seconds or 60 seconds to really describe what your tourism experience is, and hopefully within that, tie in some of that storytelling technique and principles that we'll discuss in a minute. Then after lunch, we'll look, actually no, I think right before lunch, we'll look at packaging and itinerary development. So how do you connect your experience to the person next to you, or to others in this room, or to others that have similar tourism experiences that can be connected thematically? And if you look at the wall and what we'll look at here, this is the start of it. Like, how do you connect some of the foodways, some of the crafts into itineraries and packages? And then the afternoon, we'll kind of dive deeper into that, into taking your individual experiences, and actually you all will work on developing packages that connect them with others in the room here or other tourism experiences that you see up on the wall. And then finally, we'll just wrap up with some, okay, now we have your tourism experiences, we have the itineraries that can connect it all together, and then how does that connect with the market, and how do you take those first steps to link that to the market? So that's a quick summary of today. I'll hand it over to Hallie, and then we'll get into storytelling.
Okay. I want to thank everyone for all of the ideas that you brought to the wall yesterday, because there's really a depth and richness. And when we were looking at everything kind of all blended together, what we wanted to do was curate it a little bit. So at Folk Life, our jobs when we're curators and we're thinking about programs, we're curating not objects, like if you're making an exhibition, but different cultural practices. And so the idea is looking for different themes that unite the topics that can help you communicate them. And starting at a basic level, what we decided when we were taking a look at this is to group them a bit in the types of cultural practices that we were looking at. So obviously, religious was a piece of it. There are different things here, whether it's talking about preparation of food for iftar, or religious tours, a Sephardic tour, a mosque. So it's clear that there's a story here in Bosnia and Herzegovina of religious diversity. And so this religious tours, we kind of put everything here. Then dark history, dark tourism itself is a thing, but anything that was related to the war, we put here. Food, we're going to come back to this when I'm talking in detail about how research can help us turn. This is food. It looks more like a menu or, an idea of workshops. But what we're going to talk about a bit later is how you take the experience of food in a country to teach people about its history and its people, and how you actually make those connections in storytelling. So there's a little bit here with music and dance, and I'm curious if there might be more opportunities for music and dance to integrate into tourism experiences here. A lot of craft, and I know a lot of people here are working on craft. General history here, this is where we kind of put in the Olympics and monuments, tours of the Bosnian kingdom, all the castles, the tombstones, the old bridge in Mostar. So putting that in a general history category. Then there were a lot of interesting things around health and wellness. And they're kind of, we were like looking because some of them seem to fit in nature, things like bee therapy, how to mix or use Bosnian herbs for health benefits and aromatherapy, healing thermal waters. And then we also had in here the collecting crystals as well. Again, connected to nature, but also to this health and wellness tourism. Nature over here, we've got lots, obviously we know Bosnia and Herzegovina is so beautiful and has so much great nature, but we've got here different ways of, whether it's lakes or fly fishing, trout fishing, things about endemic species, bird watching, horse riding, but then also things that are a little bit active like mushroom and berries picking, herb and tea picking, so again, intersections with food. And then here we have cross-cutting things, working on farms, and then some strategic stuff like working between hosts and agencies and synergy with other sectors. But we also put in here, there were a couple of, like 3 people that mentioned possibilities of tours with photographers or with video filmmakers and that type of experience. We put those here. So when you're thinking about a place, a destination, whether it's a region, a city, or a whole country, starting by doing this is a really great place to begin because there's a lot of different pieces to telling the story like we were talking about yesterday. You're creating an opportunity that the traveler is coming, and each interaction that they have, each experience that they have is revealing one small piece of the country to them. And so by starting it this way, we kind of can get them into categories. And the next step, which we're going to get into a little bit later, but what we're going to be doing is going a bit deeper. So rather than just saying food, we're going to ask the questions of what is it about the food? Like, what is Bosnian cuisine and why is it different from other places and what has influenced it? How do you make a connection between food and nature, food and religion, food and history? And so you start to kind of complicate the narrative a little bit. So instead of it just being about eating, people are sharing a meal and they're learning about the relationship of what we eat to all of those aspects of our life. And we're going to use food as an example, but it's also something that we can do with crafts. It's something that we can do with dark history, with regular history. All of these topics can be deepened by looking at them and asking bigger questions about what is it that these specific experiences tell about the place and how to connect them. All right.
Okay, so we're going to come back to the wall in a little bit. Here we go. But first off, let's talk a little bit about storytelling. And storytelling is probably one of the most critical parts of a great tourism experience because you are essentially translating your experience, a site, an object, and being able to tell the story of that thing, of that site, attraction, the history, the people, the food, to a visitor that may not know anything about that. So it's a critical technique to deepen the understanding beyond just, as we talked about yesterday, this kind of observational tourism of passive tourism where people are just kind of hearing or seeing an object. So storytelling really dives deeper into what that experience is. Well, thanks. It provides a voice for those sites or attractions or objects. It provokes learning, and this is a critical part because as we talked about in what that immersive, engaging tourism experience is, learning is a critical piece of creating that engaging experience. So how does a visitor learn something through that story or learn multiple things through that story that can connect them and their own context to that place. Storytelling also helps to often simplify issues. So not skipping important context, but putting it in a context that your visitor, the tourist can understand within their own context, essentially. And making those connections between the visitor and the cultural practice or the site or attraction. And also, in addition to learning, storytelling helps a visitor or visitors provoke thought. So provoke thinking, questions, ways of further engaging with that site or attraction or cultural practice. So it's about stimulating thought, it's about making connections and provoking learning for the visitor that's coming to see your site or attraction or experience the food or the craft. And there's 6 kind of overarching principles that we focus on for storytelling. The first is that you relate that object, cultural practice, or information being described to something the visitor is familiar with. So how do you relate, and we'll get into a couple of examples of this in a minute, but how do you relate the food that's on the wall there, or a specific craft that's being presented, or an object in a museum to the context of that visitor? And that's critical, because if they can relate to it, then they can understand it, they'll engage with that object, or with that food, or with that craft, or with that cultural practice in a much more meaningful way. Then the chief aim of storytelling is not instruction, but is to provoke people to think and imagine. So if we have a number of museums here, for example. So if you have specific historic objects, paintings like the Aslamazia Museum that we talked about yesterday, it's less about regurgitating a bunch of facts and dates about a specific object and more connecting that object to your visitors in ways that make them ask questions and make them kind of engage and be interested and imagine how that object, how that pot was used back in 500 years ago, how people cooked in it, how people traded with it. These kind of questions is what you want people to ask and imagine, rather than necessarily the date that it was created. Although that's important, but that's only a very small part of it. The other is storytelling for children. And there's a slightly different technique to telling stories for children versus adults. Adults, you can obviously dive into a deeper conversation potentially. But for children, it's not about diluting that information, but presenting it in slightly different ways, making a game out of it, making it fun, making it relatable for kids is a great way of engaging, if you have a family, engaging the kids in addition to the adults in ways to kind of engage with that story or those stories that are being presented. The fourth principle is tell the whole story. There may be, if we come back to a museum, there may be an object where there's debate about how old it is, about how it was used 500 years ago, about its history and the stories around it. And that's fine, but you want to present those different narratives, not just necessarily just pick one. Let the visitor understand that it's a complicated issue and that there's different pieces that come into it. Because visitors often, most of the time, are not stupid. They want to understand all the different context of what that object is and how it relates to culture and history and the world today. So telling the whole story is critical, even if some of that story is conflicting, or if it's not the most positive story, pieces of it aren't the most positive. But they want to understand the whole picture. And then ultimately balancing the amount of information that's presented. And this is, and we'll get into some of the techniques earlier, but this is also about understanding the visitor that is there. And that's part of, and we'll get into kind of the ordering of it in a little bit, But that's part of asking questions up front to your visitors to get an understanding about who they are, what they're interested in, and then spending time on the things that they're interested in and adapting your story to focus on areas where they can get engaged and they can relate, essentially, rather than a very kind of structured tour that sometimes you see where it's just regurgitating information, whether the visitor is interested in that or not. So balancing that out is a technique. It's not a science. It's more of just a kind of sense and understanding and learning as a guide or an interpreter or a storyteller of how your visitor is reacting to that information. And if they look like they're bored, then move on and focus on something else. And then ultimately make it fun and dynamic. Changing your tone, adding games in there, adding interesting information that really engages the visitor. And as you think about, we'll get into this in the next section, but as you think about these principles of storytelling, think back to your descriptions of your tourism experiences and how would you integrate these stories and integrate this information into the description and the stories that you're going to ultimately weave into the experiences that you offer. So, I actually do a different training course on this where I take everyone as guides or interpreters to Mars, and they have to do a tour of Mars. But I think it is important to step out of the context. So this is obviously has nothing to do with Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is Tanzania, this one is actually, because Mount Kilimanjaro in the back there. But as I mentioned yesterday, part of my background is safari guiding, so I'm going to take you to a totally different world, but the principles of storytelling still remain the same. And the first is, how do you relate that information to something that a visitor is familiar with? So Mount Kilimanjaro is about 6,000 meters high. If you're a European visitor, Mont Blanc is a little under 5,000 meters high. So relating, again, that's a simple relation, but relating that information to something that they're familiar with, or Mount Hood in the US. But being able to make those connections to something that a visitor can contextualize is important and helps to engage the visitor in the story and the information that you're providing. The other is to provoke thought and encourage the interaction of discussion between the visitor and yourself. And that interaction is really what creates that immersive and engaging experience. So for elephants, when we're guiding, the tusks on an elephant are essentially an extension of your canines. We use our canines for essentially cutting, so for eating and grabbing food and biting an apple and that kind of thing. An elephant uses them for digging, to find water, to find minerals, so salt licks, things like that. They also use them for defense, for fighting. But also kind of looking at how to relate that to people. So the trunk, we use our hands to grab things and to connect to people in terms of shaking your hands. An elephant uses their trunk to pick up things, to push things around, but also to connect to other elephants. As I said, we shake hands. Two elephants, when they meet, they put their trunk in each other's mouths to essentially to smell each other's breath, which would be impolite in human society, but in elephant society, it's a polite thing to do, to understand how they're feeling today and greet them, essentially. So it's connecting something that we're used to, shaking hands, connecting, picking up objects, to how, in this case, an elephant does the same thing. So interpretation for children, as I mentioned, is slightly different. So lions sleep for 20 hours a day. That sounds wonderful, especially when you have jet lag. If you could just take a nap for 20 hours a day, get up, stretch, go and get some food, and then go back to sleep. But as you're interpreting something like that for children, think about, why do they do that? Who's doing all of the work for those 4 hours? In lion society, just like in human society, the women do most of the work. The guys sit around and relax and occasionally run after each other. And then make games out of it. So like on safari in Africa, how many lions can you see? How many of those lions are sleeping versus actually getting up and doing anything? And creating those kind of games and interactive ways of stimulating imagination and engagement with a visitor. And then it's also, as I mentioned, about presenting the whole story. So in Tanzania, not the park that's next to Kilimanjaro, but a protected area just south of that called Selous. It's one of the largest protected areas in the world. Huge area. And it had, as of 5 or 10 years ago, 130,000 elephants lived there. But as of now, only 30,000 elephants live there. So 100,000 elephants have been poached in the last 5 or 10 years, have been killed in the last 5 or 10 years for their ivory. Many guides, when I was talking to guides there, that's something that they don't necessarily, they're a little uncomfortable about talking about because it's not a positive story. But by telling these kind of stories, you're giving visitors the whole picture, and you can also engage, in this kind of sense, engage visitors in being part of the solution. So many visitors would give back to conservation, to anti-poaching efforts, to other things like that. So being able to craft and kind of tell the whole story, even if it's not a particularly positive one, like killing 100,000 elephants, is essentially helps to engage the visitor and make sure you're providing that whole story to them. So that's a very quick overview. I'll get back into it, but I'm going to pass it off to Hallie to talk a bit about research, and then we'll continue on with the storytelling piece.
Today we each have our own microphones. Okay, so I started talking about research a bit yesterday, and I know that I personally am not a researcher. I work for a research institution, but I am not a researcher, and I never in my education focused that much on research. So I am speaking to you about research as a person who is not a researcher, because it can be quite intimidating to do research and to understand the relationship of research to this type of work. But the idea here of really what we're talking about is it's about learning. And so research can be something that you do in a library or that is part of going to an archive, but really the type of research I'm talking about here is also about talking to people and just generally wanting to learn and to deepen the experience. And so when you're thinking about telling a story, you have the knowledge that you've already come with. But in order to create an experience that's distinct and really provide something of value to the visitor, there are ways that you can enhance the experience by doing some of your own research. So getting started, it's just very basic. You want to have an overview of the cultural heritage, a description of the cultural heritage. I mentioned yesterday that there are cultural practices that they're part of your life, they're part of your everyday practice, and so for you, they might be just like living and breathing. It's the food you're familiar with, it's the crafts that you're used to seeing everywhere or that you use in your home. It's religious practices that are very much a part of your life, and it's your own history. But when you have a visitor coming in from outside, they don't know any of that. And so you almost have to take on a beginner's mind to think a little bit differently about what it is that you're presenting and to look for ways to make connections. So the person that's presenting the culture, the tradition bearer, we talked about that yesterday. The importance of that person being able to share their story and having a story that makes those connections is essential. Who is that person? What is their history? How did they learn what they're doing? And even I mentioned this again, just as a refresher from yesterday, it's more about the person and their passion for what they're doing. Some of the most successful people on our project in Armenia, one of which is a basket weaver who is entirely self-taught from YouTube. Basketry was important in the region where he lives, but at that point, no one was weaving baskets anymore. If someone needed a basket, they would buy an imported basket, probably from, who knows, China or India or something like that. But Artur decided he wanted to learn because he saw they had basketry in the local museum. He knew it was important for gathering grapes. They used to put wicker baskets around wine bottles and glass bottles to protect them. So he started doing research on YouTube, and the plants were all still there for making the baskets, and so he started going out into nature and gathering the materials, and he's entirely self-taught. This isn't something that was passed down. And he became so passionate about it that he started wanting to share it with others. And so he ended up creating a tourism experience that he partnered with wineries. So people who are traveling around the region, going to all of the local wineries, Artur now goes to those wineries and he teaches them how to make a basket, how to weave a basket around a bottle of wine. And then he talks, but he didn't know the history. So that part of it, he had to do the research because for him, it was culture, it was a cultural heritage that was disrupted, which I know is the case for a lot of the different practices here as well. So he had to do some research around the significance of the basket weaving and how to communicate that to an audience. So be flexible when you're thinking about these things. Just because something isn't, it's amazing if you have a tradition bearer like you who has, who's learned the practice from your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather. Those stories are unfortunately becoming rare, and they should absolutely be shared. There's a place for that type of storytelling, and then there's also a place for what I described with Artur, who's someone who didn't have that heritage but is reconnecting to it. So in addition to the person and their personal history and their story, also thinking about the practice itself. When does it occur in the calendar? Is there seasonality around it? Where does it take place? What's the connection to the environment? And that's going to be significant, again, for a lot of things that are here with regards to food, with regards to craft, any monuments or historical aspects. Why were certain places chosen for various monuments that are there? I don't have my glasses on, so that's like the cross-cutting one, and then nature. Yeah, nature's down at the end. So thinking about the significance of when it takes place, where it takes place, and then identifying the major steps that are going to take place in the creation or presentation. When you're watching a cooking show on TV, they have the little magic act that they do where they're preparing, they have all the ingredients already chopped and prepared so they can quickly assemble the dish. I love watching a cooking show and that makes it look so fast, and then I go to make that same recipe and it takes me an hour and a half to chop all the vegetables and put them, right? So think about that kind of magic in your presentation because you have a certain amount of time with an audience and storytelling, but you have to have some of those things get hidden behind the scenes, like the cook, prepares the thing and then turns around and takes it out of the oven and it's already cooked. So if you're doing a craft practice, what are the steps where you can show people, and then what do you have to skip, right? We saw a really beautiful pottery workshop in Tunisia where the process of firing, they're still using like a wood-fired kiln where you have to actually stoke a fire for days, and then you put all the pottery that you've been making inside, and then you actually build a wall with bricks, cover it with mud, and seal it. And then you set the fire for days. So obviously she couldn't show us that whole process, but she took us to the kiln and she showed us how she would do it, but we didn't get to see the whole thing. So there's all the steps of, the presentation that you're doing and talking about the context of it, but making sure that you're choosing the right aspects of the steps in the process so that people understand, especially with craft, how long things take and the type of skill and knowledge that's required. So for foodways, I wanted to share with you some specific questions that can be used. And I think, we didn't discuss this, but I'm pretty sure that you don't have to, Sumaya, are we sharing slides with people? Yeah, so you'll get a copy of all of this, because there's a lot, I know everyone, I've been seeing people taking photos, and there's a lot of content that I know will be very helpful to come back to, and we're also recording this for Turizam Academy to be online, so you can come back to the content. But here's some great questions. So thinking about our food that's on the wall over here, when you're getting specific to preparing and presenting gastronomy for tourists, what are the cultural or social circumstances for the preparation of the food? What's the significance of the ingredients? So are there local names for things? Where are they found? Botanical information? What's the traditional form of cooking, prep, and context? How has it changed over time? Is it related to a season, to a ritual, to some sort of an occasion? Is it a daily staple food or a family favorite? Or is it something that's just for a particular holiday? Are there ritual components that are involved in the preparation of the food? Are there any meanings assigned to the preparation or the consumption of the food? How is it served? Are there social norms associated with prep or the presentation of it? We talked about this yesterday around the feast and gender and those types of roles. What are the local aesthetic standards? How is the food presented on the table, on the plate? And what other activities could complement the presentation of this tradition? So we showed you the example from Sicyon Ceramics yesterday, the Hatsatun experience that they did, where because they're working in clay, the food preparation, they chose local dishes that are served in clay so that they could unite the clay that you're making, the pottery that's a part of your experience, with the food that you're also going to be making that makes that connection. So I want to give you another example of, wait, where do I have it?
I think I'm minimizing it.
It's here, no?
Yeah.
Noosh Guest House. Okay. But it's not projecting. While we're prepping this little video, I want to share with you. So Noosh is a guest house in Armenia, and there's some young people that started the guest house, and they had been living abroad, but they grew up in this community and came back. And they grew up with their dishes that they were familiar with from their family. And they were more interested in tourism. They were just thinking, this is great. Our village is beautiful. We want people to come here. And so they were creating the experience just based on an interest in like a love for their food and the desire to interact with tourists. And the people who started the experience also lived abroad and spoke a lot of different languages, so they were able to communicate with a wide range of tourists. So we knew the food was good. We knew the food was good, but we weren't like, how is this food different from anywhere else where you're going to eat? And something that was amazing that happened as a part of this research is an uncovering of 100 years of history that these young people who grew up here did not know, which is that their families actually were from Sasun, which was in eastern Armenia. And during the Armenian genocide, they left. It's now in modern Turkey, in eastern Turkey. They left that community, and they came, the Russian army evacuated them, and they came to Armenia as a result of violence and conflict, and they were looking for a new place to settle. And so they were looking for the people from Sasun because it was very mountainous. They had like a whistle and a call to be able to contact other villages in the mountains. And so they chose this place in Armenia because they were looking for a similar landscape and something that would feel like home to them. And so all of the traditions of the food, also of the fact that they would say that people in this community learned to dance before they learned to walk. And in Armenian culture, Sasun dances are very well known, even in Georgia as well. Like, it's a very specific kind of dance. And so through this process of working with the researcher and kind of doing all of this learning, These young people that created Noosh, all of a sudden were learning all of these things about their own family history. And what we did is work together with them to present this into the way that they demonstrated, talked about the history and the context. So when visitors come to Noosh Guest House, here we go. When they come to the guest house, they get to have this amazing experience, but they also get to learn about something really important in Armenia, which is the relationship of the people living in the country and the fact that Armenian people were split between two empires, between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, and about the significance of displacement and migration and that history. And I was just talking to Simon about this today. Now, more than ever, there are more people around the world who are refugees or being displaced from their homes than ever before in our recorded history. And it's happening in Ukraine right now. So people who are traveling, even tourists, many people have a story of displacement, of disconnection from their homeland. So there's also an opportunity there for people to connect on a personal level about the significance of this and how when we're going through difficult times that, really drawing on our cultural heritage as a way to make meaning and to create a sense of home in new places where we find ourselves. It's that part of that very deep connection that happens when people have an opportunity for dialogue through travel. So that's the backstory, and then here's the little marketing video for their experience. So they have the dances I was talking about. So the connection with the environment, they have almond trees there on the property. I want to bring us back to, I knew that was going to happen. Yeah, we could just keep watching all of these experiences. All right, so let me put this back up. So I want to ask you all, I want to hear from you. Let's talk about food for a few minutes. And can you give me, and maybe someone, Simon, you want to help me with the microphone for others to share? So in the examples of food, opportunities for food tourism that we have here, we have the plums fair, the agricultural fair. We have the preparation of traditional dry cookies. Chape? Okay, I'm going to butcher pronunciation. Sumaya helped me to translate these. A general culinary workshop, making food with buckwheat, Bosnian cooking, Bosnian coffee, celebration of the family saint, Slava. Let's make Krgusha, how to make pickles, pita making, and gastro tours. A competition in preparing food under the bell. How to make cheese and butter traditionally, plums again here, plum jam, gastro avlia, how to make Bosnian dolma, baklava, and hormašice, And then food making workshops, and then I don't know what that says. Drenina. A berry? Okay. Okay, so what you have here looks a bit like a menu. It's like we want to have some workshops, and these are there's some like pita, pickles, dolma, baklava. Okay, so there's some names of things. But what is it so instead of thinking about the names of foods, what stories can these foods tell us about Bosnia and Herzegovina? Yes, and I'm going to write some things on the board here.
Dobar dan još jednom svima.
Oh, hold on a second. Let me get I left my ears over here. Let me make sure it's on.
Pa,
Well, listening to you and thinking about everything you said, basically it all comes down to one story that I've just remembered. The specifics regarding food. For example, Family St. Patron's Day. That's a religious event celebrated by families, and then you have food and beverages, and food prepared for this celebration is made of local ingredients. The beverages is locally produced, which is the brandy, rakia, and you toast with this brandy, this rakia, and this is the alcoholic beverage that we produce locally, be it pear, be it apple, be it plum, depending on the region. Then secondly, depending on the area, on the region, different food is prepared. For example, we have a lot of lamb-based food, and it is prepared the day before and served to the guests. So pork meat, lamb as well. This is all meat that's prepared day before, and it's served to the guests that are coming to mark Family's St. Patron's Day. This Slava, or Family St. Patron's Day, is enlisted in the UNESCO's cultural heritage, immaterial cultural heritage, and I'm thinking that this Slava encompasses all of that you talked about, the culture, the tradition, the getting together, where people interact, focus on each other as well. It's also important, when guests are coming to this event, you know how to seat whom. The close family members, your best man, your first cousins, second cousins, elderly, younger, etc. Then there is a specific cake made for this celebration. It is prepared the day before. It is essentially bread with different ornaments, and each and every ornament has a story. It's a symbol. It's very specific and unique to our region. And if we're talking about the tourists, I guess that the target group is from the US and Europe. The tourists from the region, from the Balkans, know this. However, the Westerners coming in, I guess, don't know about this tradition, and could be, exotic to expose them to this event, to the celebration of Family St. Patron's Day. This is shortly, just briefly, the main characteristics, but there's a lot of details involved in this event.
Absolutely. Thank you for that example.
Hi, I will do this in English. Actually, the food is the most relevant one. You know, actually, our cuisine is like it's came with Ottomans, but Mr. Zoran told me Ottomans took it over from Greeks. Is it? Yes. And actually, the cuisine, how did he say it? Like culture, not holder, bear. Carriers.
Yes, the tradition
They are,
bearers.
yeah, tradition
Tradition
carriers.
bearers.
This is the skill which is getting from from generation to generation. You know, like when the food is good, like you are very famous, and our food is very, very nice. And actually, the Bosnia was not so. We were not so rich. And if you want to use the animal, you use everything.
Yes.
From I don't know. We have like tribes.
Yeah.
You use all animal.
Why
Yes.
is that? Why do you use the whole animal?
Because there is no waste. Because it's it's like that. You need to respect the food. The food is something to respect, and to getting this like knowledge about food from generation to generation between ladies. That's a huge skill, and of course they are the foundations of the family, like you said, with the lions, the lions. Like, of course, maybe the men will go and get her and get the food, and they will prepare everything. You know, they will maybe protect them, but the ladies, they were like the main one. Yeah, I grew up in the matriarchat, but like it's like that, you know, and all these traditions are very important for us, and like Mr. Guya said. Like we have this religious, because we are very rich, you know. We are very rich. We are like very multicultural, and like they have Slava. Maybe we have Iftar. We have so many of those things that we can show to our guests. So that's our treasure. So we need to present this in the best way.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one of the things that I'm hearing, and I was hoping this was going to come out, is that if you're looking at, rather than just saying food and listing food items, what's happening is that food is able to tell a story of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a multicultural place, right? Contemporary. But the other thing that's really fascinating about it that you mentioned is that food can also help people to make the connection between what they're seeing. Because when you're going around the country and you're seeing the historical piece, the cultural sites, you're seeing mosques, you're seeing Ottoman bridges that are amazing, and people might make that and think like, a lot of times people think that built heritage is something long gone. It's from people that are like a long time, they're not there anymore. But by talking about the food and tracing those connections, it helps people to make a thread, like to really understand that culture, that Ottoman Empire and the influence still lives on today in the food. And you can have a conversation and connect that so that it's not separate, right? Like that the food culture is also impacted by that occupation of the Ottomans here. Were you going to add something?
Yes, my colleague have already mentioned something that is very important. So this multicultural aspect of food in Bosnia and Herzegovina was a matter of identity and pride. So each and every of these multicultural and individual communities have their own customs, their own recipes, their own culinary skills, and they've been preserved so far. So this is a very important element in Bosnia and Herzegovina that impacted the entire history, talking about culinary. And the biggest impact was also made by Jewish people, because we are at the border between Eastern and Western Roman Empire, and then we were also at the border when the church separated in between Catholic and Orthodox. So we are also under the influence of the Pope. From the other side, we also had the influence from Istanbul, then Oriental cuisine. Actually, the root there is in Greece because Turks took it from Greece, from Greeks. And then the culture was also taken from Persia and from Arabs. They took Islam and then they brought it to us. After that, we had Jewish people coming from Spain, and it's a mixture of cuisine that includes Mediterranean cuisine, influenced by all these influences. So tourist agency, tourist organization doesn't recognize Serbian or Croatian cuisine, but Balkan cuisine, and in addition to Italian, Tunisian, and so on, we have Bosnian cuisine. So Bosnia and Herzegovina has a very diverse cuisine, food. We are also known by biodiversity. We are one of the five regions that is the most recognizable by diversity, Caucasus, Himalayas, Bosnia and Herzegovina. So all the flora and fauna, we have around 30% of endemic species, both in flora and in fauna. So those are the species existing only in this region. Then in addition to all of this, we have food, water, and culinary skills and cuisine. So that would be the Bosnian story. So it is not only that we are multicultural, but also very multinatural nation. Not to enlist all the different species. So everything in the encyclopedia that you can see in pairs, such as wolf, then a special species of wolf is kurjak, and those are basically two different species of wolf. Then Ursus arctos would be bear, but then you would also see Ursus arctos bosniacum, which is actually the Bosnian bear, which is again specific and that we are known of. So basically we have a very long-standing tradition in all of these things.
And what you can see here, I think, is, we use food as the example, but even in this conversation, we've pretty much touched everything that's on the wall there. Mm-hmm. In terms of you're using food as the base, but there's craft components, there's history, there's nature. All of this kind of weaves into that overall story that is based on essentially eating something.
And the thing to add here is that it's not the burden of, I'm going to present food to visitors and therefore I'm going to share with them the whole story of the whole country. The trick to the storytelling and to make it compelling that's why I showed you Noosh, because it's two individuals and their family history. And their personal piece of it tells that story of migration, of movement, of the influence of the meals from Sassoon, and talking about why people moved from what is now Turkey to Armenia and the relationship of empire. But people are able to connect on a person-to-person level. It's much easier for people to have that connection when you're sharing a personal history as a piece of it. So the idea is that as people are traveling around the country, what we're hoping is that each meal that they're having is, again, revealing a piece of this full picture of the biodiversity of the country, of the multiculturalism in the country, of how much it's been a crossroads of so many different influences around the world. So when you're choosing what food you're going to present to the tourists, choosing a meal that's very much rooted in your local location, in what the foodways and the ingredients are, so you can communicate about the significance of those ingredients, and then also rooting it in history. And doing that by asking questions. That might be asking family, asking other people in the community, consulting some scholars, looking to some text to really make that connection and understand, and then looking around you of what's there, not just with the biodiversity piece, but also looking at the influence from history and what's around you. And if you're talking about the Greek influence or the Jewish influence, is there some other site in the destination that also, helps visitors to make a connection to that context? Any questions about this? Does it seem like something that you're able to do? Does it feel, yeah? That sounds exciting or interesting? I hope. Yeah. I mean, the other thing you're trying to do here is the best, cultural exchange is two ways. And so when you're doing this successfully, what's happening for that visitor is they're also thinking about their own family history, right? And you're provoking conversation. How can they share with you about their own practices and what they cook? Because that's the kind of the really unforgettable moments of cultural exchange is when you sit down across from, a meal is a really good example of that. When you sit down and you share a meal with someone and they share with you their history, and then you're thinking back to your own story and making that connection. Cool. I think that might be the end of my section, Simon. Are you next? Yeah, okay. Great, thank you.
All right. Yeah. So what we're going to do is I'm going to come back to that storytelling and essentially some techniques or things to think about for crafting your story, and a couple of examples. Again, we keep coming back to Armenia, but a couple of examples from Armenia. And then while I'm doing this, and before we take a coffee break, have a think about other stories that relate to the experiences you've been writing down, because I'd love to hear from you in 5 minutes before we go for coffee of some of your ideas about stories that you can weave in. Yeah, that was a great, the one with food that we just talked about was great, but other stories you can weave into your experiences that you're planning to develop. Okay. So a couple of things to think about when you're developing, crafting, thinking about your story is one of the principal pieces is prepare in advance. Before you jump into telling a story or develop or actually kind of offering your experience to visitors, it's critical to prepare. As Hallie said, chopping the vegetables beforehand is also about planning your stories, putting them. We'll talk a little bit about narrative development, but putting them on paper, having a structure to the stories you'd like to tell during your visitor experience will help to then create a kind of smooth and refined and high quality tourism experience. It's not about creating this kind of blank narrative that you just regurgitate. It's about just putting your thoughts together and structuring it so that as you run through your tourism experience and you want to talk about a story of this or that, you have that kind of structure already laid out. And part of that is, what do you want the visitor to learn? What questions do you want them, and we mentioned this yesterday, but what questions do you want them to answer by the time they leave? Do you want them to understand through that dinner or lunch that they may have? Do you want them to be able to walk away understanding how to maybe prepare a specific food item, understand about some of the religious context or the historical context or the natural context? But what are those questions you want them to be able to walk away with? And how through those conversations, through those stories, how do you encourage them to learn and discover on their own? So with food preparation, one of the things we worked with one of the food experiences was a place called Kachuch, where they were an existing restaurant, but we created this food experience with them, or they created it and we helped them. But one of the things was she kind of presented and showed how to make Armenian dolma, which of course in Armenia they figured that was where dolma was created and everyone else stole it from them, or not stole it, but it went out from Armenia from there, just like everyone else thinks. But what she did was then visitors could then kind of pick and choose and refine their own kind of recipe, essentially, for how they wanted to create their own dolma that they would try later. So allow the visitor to kind of discover and learn for themselves also helps to engage that visitor in the experience. And ask questions. You want to ask questions up front from the visitor to understand them. Ask questions throughout the experience, but also prep for the type of questions that you might get asked from a visitor. And that could be anything from the historical context of how the Jewish religion ended up, having an influence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, or it could be, what's your favorite football team? You're going to get asked lots of different questions from the visitors. So have other colleagues, have people from like us and the project, or just friends of yours to come and just kind of pepper you with questions as you kind of test and refine and run through your experience, because you're going to get a lot of different questions that are not necessarily the kind of core stories that you want to present and want people to be able to answer those questions at the end. Think about also the broader context. So how does your tourism experience link to others in the region and other experiences they're likely to have, as well as their broader context, global politics and activities and other things that are going on the global level. So if they're coming and seeing the bridge, how does your experience connect to the history of the bridge, or connect to something else that they might be experiencing while they're there? And as Hallie's already mentioned this, but making it personal is critical. If it's about your personal story, those are the stories and the memories that people take back with them, that really create that engaging and unique experience. So the easiest way to talk about this is through examples, and I'm going to come back to Sicilian ceramics again as an example of this. In terms of structuring, so we worked with Sicilian Ceramics to kind of structure the tour that they would provide, and there's two different pieces of this. There's the individual stories that you'll tell throughout the experience. So if a visitor is going to be with you for maybe 3 or 4 hours, there's a number of different stories that you're going to be talking about throughout that. And each story should have an introduction, the content, the kind of meat of the story that you're developing, and then also the conclusion. So how that relates to other stories you might tell, how that relates to something they may be doing, whether it's, in this case, throwing a pot or painting a piece of ceramic or food that someone's eating. And then, so that's the individual stories. But then each of those stories are put together to create the overall experience that a visitor will have. So within that overall experience, what's the introduction? So what's again, as you're thinking through your story, what's the first story or introductory kind of commentary, if you will, that you'd like to give visitors? So in Sicilian Ceramics' case, visitors would arrive. If it was a nice day, they would greet the visitors and give maybe a 10-minute just intro to who they are, their personal story as you saw that in some of the videos, but their personal story in how they created the business, their connection with pottery, how they learned that, the region, a little bit about the region, because it connects to the history of the pottery that they're creating, and then broadly a summary of what they're going to do. So, okay, as your visitor, throughout your experience, we're going to tour the gardens. We're going to see where the clay is dug up and then processed. We're going to go in and see the house and where the pottery is and some of the pottery that's already been made. And then we're going to show you how to throw a pot. You're going to throw a pot, and then we'll have some meal. So just kind of introduce it to the visitor, but also put it in the context of how it fits within their personal story. Then you have these stories throughout. So in Sicilian Ceramics, they'd have one story about the clay itself, how traditionally that clay was dug up, how it was processed, why it was important, and why specific clay was a focus for that region. And And that was a story. Then there's another story when you're in the pottery about how do you actually technically throw a pot and build a pot and the kind of techniques around that. So there was a story based on that piece as well. And then a number of other stories as well. But then within that suite of stories, you have transitions. So as you're moving from the place where they were digging up the clay to the building where you're actually going to see a pot being created, that's an opportunity to throw in additional information. It may not be a full story, but other facts, other interests, other things that a visitor may ask, other questions they may come up with, or you may want to pose as you're walking through. And this all depends on, obviously, each individual experience. If when I was guiding and you're walking, you're doing a walking tour, you've obviously got 4 hours or something like that where you're transitioning through a landscape. So you've got a lot more transitional type storytelling as you're walking along, as you're experiencing, as you're running into buffalo and trying to avoid them and all of that kind of fun stuff. So there's a lot more transition type conversations there. But if you're a more kind of sedentary experience, like a craft experience like this, there's a lot more kind of fixed stories and less transition. But you want to have some of these other things that you might throw in here and there through conversations and through questions that you might be asked. And then I've already mentioned this, but creating that narrative guide is a really great way of just kind of structuring the overall story you want to tell and individual pieces of that story that you want to tell. And it's not a script. It's not something you read from, but it's just a guiding principle of what you want to kind of focus the experience on. And what I might do, actually, because we haven't pulled up, is... So just as an example, these are in English, but we're not going to read them. We're just going to give you an example. So this is Sicilian ceramics, but they... Oh, yeah, okay. This one is translated. This is actually, sorry, this is one that you will have access to when they send around the PowerPoint and other links. You'll be able to use this. Even if it's just as a template. We had others. I thought this was the English one, but it's not. So this is great. So this is just an example of different, kind of the intro. Don't want to do anything to it. The intro, different stories that you'd want to talk about along the way, transitions. Essentially just putting it down in context so that you can have a basis for structuring your overall experience. And then also what it does is as you hopefully grow and others join your business, you then have a basis to be able to allow them to kind of partake in that story as well, to have a basis for the interpretive experience that they'll provide, and hopefully they'll then add to that and flesh it out even more. And it's an evolving document that can help to kind of broaden and flesh out that experience. So also, this is one experience, Sicilian ceramics, but how it connects to other experiences and the broader experience that visitors are going to have within the landscape and within the region, and other tourism experiences that make up that overall package. So great example here is Sicilian ceramics. So as you know, and as you've seen from the video yesterday, they have an experience where you can see the pottery, you can throw the pot, you can also paint the pots or the mugs or the plates yourself. By the way, I tried this and painting is not my forte. I didn't put a picture of what I created because it was awful. But one of the things that they do is they have these designs on some of the mugs that are petroglyphs from 10,000 years ago that are up on rocks in the mountains. So you can see up here, these are some of the motifs, the designs from the petroglyphs from 10,000 years ago that they're using on the pots that they're creating. So you kind of learn about that history. But then what happened was another business owner called Bassin Tours then took that history or built on that history and created a tour where you could actually go up in an old Soviet Jeep and go up into the mountains and walk into the this lake up in the mountains where all these petroglyphs, there's like thousands of them just scattered around this lake. So you can actually then take another tour after you've been to Sisian. You've seen that, you've learned a bit about the history, and then you connect into another experience that actually allows you to then go and discover it. So what you can find through these stories is how you connect with other tourism experiences that overall will make this kind of great tourism experience and package, multi-day package for the region. So before we break for coffee, just a couple of things to think about as it relates to your own tourism experiences and the concepts you're developing. Messaging is important, and the stories that you create are a part of how you're going to tell that story and how you're going to connect with visitors to make them think, okay, I definitely need to come and do this. So what we're going to be able to be doing after the coffee break is thinking about how you describe that product in 30 or 60 seconds, depending on who you want to listen to. And then also how you want to use that material for promotion. So if you're able to distill your experience into 60 seconds, you can create a little video of that. Even if it's yourself or there's others, there's some great examples I saw yesterday of similar kind of 60-second or couple of minute videos of experiences that you can have. But that helps to tell the story to the visitor and connect to them. So if you can tease the visitor on the type of experience they're going to have, it helps you distinguish from maybe other things that people are going to be offering as well. So this storytelling is great for the actual experience, but it also distills down into how you're going to market your experience as well, and how you're going to engage with that traveler before they even arrive, so that they say, I want to come to your experience versus maybe some other things that will be a bit more generic. So with that, let's see what time it is. Maybe it's 11 o'clock. Maybe what we'll do is we'll break for a coffee break, have a think about your experiences, your stories, and then we'll start after the coffee break with just asking if some of you here can talk about the stories that you'd like to present essentially through your experiences. So we'll break, we'll come back at 11:30 and kick off with that. Hallie, anything else? All right. Thanks.